Okay. Yeah,
You'll
so
have
the
to
question
excuse me.
the question I just posed is, does income inequality have a negative effect on our nation's health outcomes? And Colin says yes. If he's willing to explain a little bit, I'd love to hear.
So a lot of this I'm getting from my former roommate who just graduated with a health administration degree from VCU. Super proud of her. But there are a lot of disparities in the American healthcare system that are very much wealth related. First and foremost, because we have a for-profit healthcare system. So if you can't afford it, then we're the richest nation in the world where people die because they can't afford insulin. But there are other factors where just having lower incomes and dealing with the stresses of not just like abject poverty, but the stress of lower income, medically speaking, breaks down your body, takes years off your life, and makes you so much more correlatively likely to have these really high comorbidity rates with things like just all sorts of different medical diseases. So these are statistics that you don't see in the wealthy populations. You like the lower off you are in America, the more likely you are to be in poor health, not only because being poor is bad for your health, but if you're poor, you can't access healthcare on top of that.
Yeah, great points. Thank you very much. And I agree with a lot of what you're saying, most of it. And here's my just pushback as the instructor of the class and an economist. I would say a lot of what you mentioned had to do with being poor, had to do with not having money, not having the resources, which is actually, it matters, but it's almost a different question, right? Whether or not a country is too poor to afford good health care, or whether it's the income inequality or the wealth inequality itself that's causing these bad healthcare outcomes. And I actually think, first of all, I think you're not wrong. I just want to refocus the debate on, it's not that we don't have the money. We have the highest GDP in the world, the United States does. Our government has trillions of dollars. I mean, of course, there are trillions of dollars in debt too, but there's a very healthy flow of money into and out of our federal government and our state governments. They're functional for the most part. There is money that could be used to improve the healthcare of everyone, but I think Colin's point that made the most sense to me is that it's because it's a for-profit industry. There isn't a lot of an incentive for the healthcare industry to cater its services to people who can't pay, people who are uninsured and people who don't have the money. Even if you did like give them a $10,000 medical bill, they wouldn't be able to pay for it. So that's where the inequality comes into play. It's not just that there's some poor people. Sorry, it does matter that there's poor people, but it also matters the distribution. Because let's compare the United States now to 1970. We have a lot more income inequality now than we did then, and a big reason is that median household income just hasn't changed that much in real terms. Right? So, the wealthy sector has gotten richer and richer and richer, and the less has the median has stayed roughly the same, controlling for inflation, and that has made a bigger difference in terms of income inequality over the past 50 years. So, if the healthcare industry is for profit and they're thinking, how can we make the most money? It's not going to be to cater to people who are uninsured and don't have a lot of money. So it could be that the income inequality itself is causing this problem. It's not that Americans are poor or rich, it's that the disparity means they get a very different quality of healthcare in this country. And that could be bad for us as a whole because, our total metrics of health outcomes are worse. So actually, I think, oh gosh, do we have a whole debate about that? We have a debate on healthcare. Sorry. So on October 30th, we are going to have between Shreyas and Shilpa, there will be a debate on whether we should have universal public health insurance coverage. So everybody, every person in this country, maybe we'll decide if it's just citizens rather than non-citizens, or people who have a visa and are visiting here. But we can debate that later. We will talk about that if that would somehow make things better. But right now, I do think a lot of economists think the growing income inequality in this country has also led to worse health outcomes, especially for people on the bottom who don't have the resources to participate in this for-profit health system that has emerged, in part because of the prosperity of everybody else. Okay, so good points. Let me share the slides now. Now that we've done that. What other effects of income inequality do I have here? Slideshow from current slide. I think there could be effective borrowing increases, and I think there's some evidence of that. We live in a country where credit is very, very available. If you want to borrow money, there's people out there just dying to loan it to you. And if you, like, let's say you live in a community where everybody else is, spending a lot of money on their house, and it just seems like by comparison you have a very little money. Sometimes you need to borrow money just to keep up with them. Like, for example, your kids, you don't want your kids to go to school and be obviously poorer than everyone else. There's some sort of stigma attached to that. And if everybody else is buying new clothes for their kids and when I was in school, they were trapper keepers were the coolest things, but whatever the gadgets the kids have these days, I could see how that I have a bullet point that says borrowing increases, but in my mind, it's more than that. It's maybe just more reckless spending, right? Where you're being less responsible with how you spend your money because you care about your relative standing based on how you are compared to other people. And of course, there's political power for wealthy, perhaps some turmoil for the poor. We had these Occupy Wall Street protests, less than a decade ago. I don't remember, 6 or 7 years ago, and those threatened to sort of take down the whole system of how money is made, and how the financial markets, and how money is sort of centered in a few very powerful institutions. And that was a serious threat. That was because of income inequality. If there was more income equality in this country, I don't think you would have seen a protest the size of Occupy Wall Street. And then, of course, the opposing view, income inequality is necessary for economic growth. That's what a lot of economists would say too. This is what Milton Friedman would certainly say this. Every country that's had any sort of prosperity, it has come with some income equality. Okay, next slide. How does the US compare to other countries? Well, we are, if you compare the Gini coefficients, we're actually somewhere in the middle here, but that's before transfers. By transfers, I mean taxes and all sorts of taxes that you pay and benefits you receive. If you include all of that in there, Gini, the US has the highest Gini coefficient of all the comparison countries. We are the most unequal. This is what this 38 is. By the way, this is a Gini index, which means you take the coefficient times 100. Okay, so what does that mean? Who cares? I had this paper I wanted you guys to read. I'm not sure you did, but I do want to talk about it today. We're going to talk about it today. After this, wealth inequality is even harder to measure than income inequality because you don't report wealth. Nobody has a good way to measure their entire net worth and report it. I mean, a lot of people I don't want you to know how much wealth I have. But wealth inequality is actually a lot worse than income inequality because it accumulates over time. There's a little video here. Maybe I'll show you. It's this one here. Briefly, let me just briefly show you this video. Why does it say I'm not signed in? Yes, I am. Okay, here we go. This is a brief something about inequality and wealth inequality in America. Here's a 20% group. They asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. So can you hear this? This guy talking about, it's a survey. I mentioned this survey before. 5,000 people surveyed. What do you think the distribution of wealth is in this country? Okay, can you hear when he's talking? I'll play it again. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly. The notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution, shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart, but the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. What do you think about that? I'm not going to show you the whole video, but that's the results of a survey, 5,000 people. You know, you ask somebody on the street these sorts of questions. What do you think wealth distribution looks like? What do you think it should be? I don't think they're going to really spend a lot of their time thinking really deeply and hard about the ramifications of like what it would take to get such a more equal society. You know, they don't want a revolution. I think the average person on the street doesn't. I think what the interesting thing about that survey was actually maybe people haven't thought about just how unequal our country has become, and while there's so maybe there's a fundamental belief where people should have their own responsibility for their income and their wealth. And people who succeed, great. They deserve to keep everything that they have earned. That's the reward of doing a good job, is getting a lot of money. But they sort of think that system corresponds to a reality where it's not that unequal. They just don't realize how that system that they want, that if you ask them, do you think, let's say the executives of, the CEOs of a company, should they be paid as much as unlimited, what are these bonuses where, your company fails, you get fired and you get $100 million anyway, because it's written in your contract. They don't think about the ramifications of just how. Actually, they might vote against that. I take that back. I should have picked something that was more benign, that people agree with. It's part of the American way. Is you work hard and you get rewarded for it. But I think the point of that is people don't really realize the extent to which there have become these two extremes in this country of just how much money some people have. Okay, let me go to the next thing I wanted to talk about. Intergenerational mobility. That's the next thing I want to talk about. That means how able are children to succeed uh, based on their parents' success. So, you know, if you're a parent in the top 10% of, let's say, income earners, how well do your children do when they become adults? And compare that to, let's say, the bottom 10%. And so I have a study here that I'm going to refer to, and they restrict it to males only. And it's not because they're sexist and they think only males matter. I think the reason is because over time, the participation in the workplace of females has changed sort of dramatically. And in order to, and in fact, in different rates in different countries, certain countries had more women enter the workplace at different times. And in order to just ignore all of that, those effects, those are confounding effects. This particular research only looked at males. They said they took fathers and sons and said, how correlated are their incomes? Are the high income fathers having high income sons? Low income fathers having low income sons? And so this study gathered this data and did it across many countries. Okay. And then what did they plot on a graph? They plotted something called the elasticity, the intergenerational income elasticity. Do I need to explain this a little bit? You guys are economists. Maybe you've heard the term elasticity before. You can sort of think of it as a slope, but a slope that has been adjusted for, so like the percentage change, the percent change of an increase divided by the percent change of an increase of something else. That's what we mean when we say elasticity. In other words, if your dad is 10% richer, what percent richer would I expect the son to be? And if the elasticity is 1, that means if my dad were somehow 10% richer, then I would expect myself to be 10% richer. Does that make sense? That's what elasticity means. So the countries with higher elasticity have less intergenerational mobility. Does that make sense? I'm going to put this in the chat. I'm talking about intergenerational income elasticity. So it's a fancy term, but we're just talking about. Think of, okay, I gotta mention the Trumps here, and even Donald, the president. His dad was a really rich guy and gave him a lot of money, and I I don't think it's a coincidence that Trump, the president, became so rich given how his father acted. And then Trump's kids, of course, are doing really well for themselves. The question is, how much of that is built into our country? Is it a function of our society that rich parents are going to have rich kids? And instead of thinking of wealth, because wealth can be transferred, just handing wealth from me to you, that happens. But let's just talk about income. The intergenerational income elasticity measures how much rich, I'm going to be as simple as possible here. Right? How much rich parents tend to have rich kids, right? So like, how do you think this is in the US compared to those other countries like the G8 countries? What's your guess? Without reading the paper, what is your hunch? Compare us to Canada, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Italy, Spain. Do we have a high income elasticity across generations? Let me remind you, the higher the elasticity, the more favoritism, you might say, the country has? How does our I'm starting to worry no one's paying attention to me. I have this bad feeling. I think we're on the higher end of the spectrum. Thank you, Colin. At least one person's paying attention. Um, yes. Oh, Ria. All right, two people. You guys are correct. If you compare the US to France, Germany, Italy, UK, Japan, we are the highest. We have the most of this sort of favoritism where, and doesn't this go against what we think of as the sort of American ideal of, people who work the hardest are going to become the richest. People who, people who are lazy, they're the ones who are going to be poor. But if you're an American and you work hard, you're gonna make it. If people have this idea, that's one of the things they love about this country. But despite that, we still have this high intergenerational income elasticity. So this paper went further and said, why? What's going on here? And okay, so the one thing they looked at is income inequality. Maybe the reason we have this is because we just live in a country where there happens to be a lot of income inequality. So what they did was plot this favoritism index compared to the income inequality of the country. And what do you think they found? Was it correlated? Positively correlated or negatively correlated? Let me show you the picture. I think you're ready to see this picture now. I think I've explained it. Where is it? Let's go here. Share this. Escape from this. Escape.
But let's look at it another way.
Whoops. Sorry about that. This. Here we go. Hopefully you can see this. I might zoom in. Here we go. So generational earnings elasticity, that's what I was talking about. Oh gosh, we weren't the highest. According to this, we were among the highest. Italy and UK were also up with us, but then these other countries were a lot lower. So if you can see this graph, hopefully you can see this graph. It has a name. It's called the Great Gatsby curve. Has anybody read the Great Gatsby? Because I haven't. I don't get this reference because I haven't read. I'm not a very well-read person. I don't know what the Great Gatsby is about. I do know a little bit what the Great Gatsby is about. It has some themes of intergenerational wealth transfer. This person who is rich and powerful because, I don't know, maybe his parents were rich and powerful, but somehow, maybe I should read the Great Gatsby just so I can put this curve in better context. So actually, if somebody has read it and can give me a better segue, I would love it. I should read the cliff notes is what I should do. Okay, so the United States is this top right here. And this correlation seems to be pretty strong, that the countries that have more income inequality are also going to have less mobility across generations. That's another way to say it. The higher you are, the less mobility there is from one generation to the next. And the US seems to be sort of bad on both dimensions. But maybe you would expect that. You think this because, like Trump's kids were able to just go do something that made them a ton of money because they live in a country where you can find these jobs where someone will pay you a ton of money just to be someone, just to be a spokesperson for something. Who knows? So the researchers weren't done. They wanted to look even further, like what's causing this? There must be a third thing that's causing both of these, or there could potentially be. So, oh, I got a chat. Let me look at the chat. In countries like Canada or New Zealand, why is income elasticity not as high? Good question. Let me share that again. Canada and New Zealand, why is income inelasticity? You're talking about intergenerational, right? Yeah, so that's what the researchers were trying to answer with this. Actually, it's one guy, Miles. This is what Miles was looking at. There's an answer. I'll scroll down to give you the answer. Oh, by the way, here's another just comparison between the U.S. and Canada. Look, you can look and see here that these are the sons of fathers who had the top 10% of earnings. It's not like you're guaranteed to do well if your father is rich, but you're certainly much more likely to do well than to have a low income here. And it's much more in the US, which is blue, as opposed to Canada, which is pink. It's true in Canada also. In Canada, there is still some, you know, I don't know if favoritism is the right word, but there's mobility, but it's not perfect mobility. And in the US, there's less mobility. This is the top earnings, the top 10%, top decile. Here's one of the bottom deciles. So if your father is in the bottom 10%, the son is more likely in the US to be in the bottom decile than it is in Canada. And there's still this lower trend in both countries. It's just, this graph shows that it's true in every country that there's some persistence between generation, but it's just worse in this country. So why? What is it about the US and that's different than Canada? Well, I'm scrolling down. Look at this. Higher returns to schooling are associated with lower intergenerational earnings mobility. What do you guys think of this graph? On the x-axis is something called the college earnings premium for men 25 to 34. This is how much more do you get by having a college degree? In this country, there's a big difference. There's a very big difference between having a college degree and not. Other countries, there's less of a difference. And these countries there's this positive correlation here between how important it is in your country to go to school. This is about signaling too, isn't it? I really think the US is in the top right here. A lot of that is because we have a system of signaling, and perhaps part of that is put into place because to sort of let rich people have their kids go to good colleges that they can afford and therefore get the good jobs that they want them to get. And you could argue that it's a causal effect here, that because, I mean, you can never look at a graph like this and say, well, post hoc ergo propter hoc, because that's not the right fallacy. It's just correlation doesn't always imply causation. And this positive slope of this red line, you can't say it's because of the college earnings premium that there's less mobility. But at least in this case, you can imagine a mechanism behind it. You can imagine that there is something driving this that makes it causal, and that is because richer people can afford to just spend a lot of money on their kids' education. Those kids end up getting better jobs in the future. And it's just more pronounced in this country than it is in any of these other countries that we would compare to. A lot of these other countries have public tuition-free colleges, right? So this could be an argument in favor of having free tuition for our universities, because it's making us have less mobility. And if we sort of think that's a fundamental American ideal, that everyone should have a chance to make it in this country, we should want there to be more mobility across generations. These countries down here, like the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Canada, they're doing much better than we are in terms of anyone can make it in this country. Okay, so that's really one of the main things that this paper found. Of course, higher income families in the United States have higher enrichment expenditures on their children. It's just, and it's getting more drastic over time. Look how much the top income quintile spends on their kids over time per child. It just goes up and up and up, 8,000 now. Whereas the bottom income quintile doesn't spend. They can't afford to. They can't spend as much on their children. And that expenditure matters. That's what this study found. So it's sort of all racked up here. Like, what's the takeaway? That this income inequality has these other effects too. It's affecting income, intergenerational mobility, the returns to education, and everything is combining in a way that sort of goes against what most Americans would think. I showed you this wealth graph. I showed you this wealth survey at the beginning because I wanted you to think, or at least be reminded of what most Americans think about what's the proper distribution of wealth. We do want the rich people to have more than the poor people, but it should still be comparable, right? It should be that everyone maybe has enough to survive. And then once you see the reality, I'd imagine that everyday person on the street, once they saw the reality, would be a little bit shocked. And maybe they would start to question what they thought was sort of a fundamentally true thing about the way society should be run. So that, from an economics perspective, I want to show you the elasticities and show you the graphs, because that's all based on data that says, we can't prove that because there's a really high return for education and how much you spend on your kids, that in this country, it's causing there to be less mobility. But we can show you the graph where that's really correlated. And you can think on your own of a mechanism that would support that hypothesis. I think that's what good economists do. They say, I can't prove this, but what I can do is show you the data and tell you a story that's consistent with that data, that it's almost a theory. I have a theory which can explain what we observe, and I can support that theory using this data. And I think that's what good economists do. That's what you should try to be like in your life. Okay, what else do I have to share with you? Oh, I don't have much time. Don't have much time. This is what I was just talking about, the equality of opportunity. That paper was written in 2013. This is the last slide for this. The Warren Buffett rule says that it's about progressive taxes, that in a company, the top earners should pay a percentage in taxes at least as high as the secretaries, the low income workers. And at some point it was getting popular, but I feel like nobody talks about that anymore. Maybe it's not even worth mentioning in this class. Putting limits on executive pay was something which was very, very popular. And I think it almost had enough leverage to become law, but it didn't. CEOs currently make about 300 times their average employee, even though it used to be only 20 times in the 1960s. And, what's going on here? Are CEOs just getting that good? They're so much better now than they were in the 1960s that they're being paid 300 times their employees as opposed to 20 times. We should think about what the labor market did. So this was, if I had more time, and I will on Wednesday, I will segment into labor economics and their view of supply and demand for labor, because I think it's going to matter for the next two. It's certainly going to matter for minimum wage. It's like the main thing we should be talking about when we talk about minimum wage is, what is the market for labor look like? What does the supply of labor look like? What does the demand for labor look like? And What's an equilibrium of this market? Does an equilibrium even exist? And do we approach that equilibrium? And then we can talk about what happens when there's a flow of immigrants that come in, like an influx of immigration. What does that do to labor supply? I think you know what it does to labor supply, right? It increases it. What does it do to labor demand? We could talk about that too. If there's a minimum wage where prior to, I want to hire people for $10 per hour, that's their wage, but then the government says you're not allowed to do that anymore. You have to pay them at least $15 per hour. We're going to debate this, whether it should go up to $15 per hour. You have to know, my job as an economist, as an economics professor, is to teach you certainly this. If you come away with nothing else with this labor market stuff, is at least be able to picture in your mind this graph of the labor market with labor supply and labor demand. And then you can like say, okay, what happens if this happens? Immigration, minimum wage, you know, any other type of reforms, right? That's what economics is about. It's giving you a framework to think about the world so that once something happens where you're like, okay, well, what would we do if this happened? What would be the proper response? We have a framework to work with. So we'll do that on Wednesday. Wednesday will be largely going over just what exactly a labor market looks like in terms of supply and demand, and have another discussion, maybe an exercise. I'd like to do an exercise. But then on Friday, we have our debate about immigration. So hopefully you guys will have homework due on that Friday as well. Do you guys have any questions about this? This is a little informal discussion about income inequality and segueing into the labor market. But I hope it still made sense. And if you did have any questions, I can answer. I can talk to you afterwards. I'll stop the recording now.